Three little birds sat on my window and told me I don't need to worry.
What's going on? Nothing much. Nothing much.
Like cinnamon, so sweet.
So why is Black Friday a thing? Well, it was originally this day where companies went from the red to the black for the fiscal year. No, I know that, but I mean, like, why do we live in a society where Black Friday exists? A day where the prices on all these items drop and people rush to the store to try to get the best deals on them. Oh, well, I mean, a company can do whatever they want to bring in more sale volume or brand loyalty, and then there's also the smaller trinket item sales that go on too that bring in revenue. Okay, but I guess I'm wondering how the value of something can change on just one day a year, and then the next week go back to where it was, even though it's the same physical object. Well, that's a good point. I mean, maybe we should distinguish between the value of something and the sale price of it. Exchange value. It's going to be a quantitative relationship between two things. And we could generally think of it as the price of something. For instance, I could say one apple is worth $1. Now, one item or one thing could have several exchange values. One apple could be worth $1, it could be worth 2 yens, or it could even be worth 2 bananas. Because of this, the exchange value only gives us the appearance of the value of something rather than an inherent or objective quality of an item. So that's why it's quantitative. Just to drive that point home, there is no $1 amount that is contained within the atoms of one apple. It's purely relative to and specific to the time and place in which it is being sold. Okay, so we have a situation where the company is changing the price on something, but the value stays the same. Well, maybe the value of something is determined at that point of interaction between the buyer and the seller. Regardless of how much it was originally selling for, the true value is determined at that time and place and is agreed upon by the buyer and the seller. So it's subjective rather than some inherent value of the item. The subjective theory of value, as proposed by Carl Menger in Principles of Economics, value is a judgment economizing men make about the importance of goods at their disposal for the maintenance of their lives and well-being. To sum all that up, it's basically saying that value is dependent on the buyer and the seller. Just to be clear, Menger was not the one who came up with modern economic theory in terms of supply and demand, but his ideas led to this, and as well as others' ideas led to supply and demand theory, basically saying that the demand of a buyer and the supply of a seller leads to a certain equilibrium point of quantity, which leads to a certain price for a good. What was I going to say? The important point to note here is that we're looking at the value or interpretation, the subjective value as determined by the buyer and the seller, not accounting for things like negative externalities, which basically is a way of saying how do people outside of the buyer and seller value a good. Okay, so that's like supply and demand, where the seller's supply meets the buyer's demand, you get a certain price and quantity of goods sold. Yeah, supply and demand, that's what determines value. I mean, it makes sense. That's what we've been doing for 100 years. Yeah, and so I guess in this type of society, it would make sense that we'd have this one day a year, almost like a festival where we celebrate the buyer and the seller. Yeah. So is that it? Did we figure out where value comes from? I think so. It seems like we're still pretty early on in this video, though. But you know, that makes me wonder. We have a way for the buyer and seller to value an item, but what about the rest of society? What about the person working the register on Black Friday, or the people who made the item? Are they behind the scenes agreeing on this buyer and seller determined value? Do they value their time and effort less since the item sold for less? What about the resources that went into making it? Are they worth less than what they began as? Well, it does seem like we've maybe made a narrow assessment of value that doesn't consider everyone involved. Do we need to, though? I mean, aren't the buyer and the seller the important people to consider? If by important you mean affected by the sale, then no, because other people, like the workers who made the item, do assign a value to that item. Let's say a buyer and a seller agree that something is worth $2. For the seller to profit at that price, they have to either cut the worker's pay in half or find someone else to work for that lower pay. So the buyer and seller have agreed on a price, but the workers have not agreed to a lower price for the time spent making the item. While the workers don't end up owning the item or directly pocketing the money from the sale, they are affected by the decisions made between the buyer and the seller, and therefore their valuation of the item should also be considered. And all this doesn't even consider the value of the resources and technology used to make the item as well. Okay, so this subjective theory of value does seem to correctly point out that value depends on the person who is valuing the item and not some inherent property of the item. Yeah, and while we're at it, let's call the item that we're talking about a commodity, since we're on the topic of Black Friday. Commodity. A thing through which its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind. Marx goes on to clarify that needs includes both physical needs like food, air, and water, as well as our desires or what we want to have, which he called imaginative needs. And this can be directly through direct consumption, like eating an apple, or it could be indirectly through a means of production which allows us to directly consume it. Through the work of an apple picker, we're able to directly eat the apple. But the subjective theory of value still doesn't tell us where value comes from. Like, yeah, it comes from the person who's making the value decision, but where do they get their idea of value? Maybe are they born with it? Well, let's consider a game of Connect 4. If we place that game of Connect 4 next to a baby, would they be able to tell us the price of it or how much they value it? Well, no, babies can't talk. Okay, well, what about a 3-year-old? Well, I think maybe they could tell you what it would cost, but I don't think they would have a good idea of what that price means other than a bunch of numbers. Okay, so the individual isn't born with an innate sense of the value of commodities, and so the subjective theory of value, by basing it on the individual's interpretation of value, still doesn't tell us where value comes from, since we aren't born with it. Well, an adult could tell you that a game of Connect 4 costs $10, which is equal to half an hour's work for them. Okay, so value comes from the meaning we give to commodities in relation to how long we work? Well, I think you could say value is interpreted as that based on what we learned growing up. Remember though, there's no inherent objective property of a commodity that gives it value. Anything that exists outside of our minds just exists. And in the grand scheme of things, we're all just living on a planet that will one day be engulfed by the sun. So in the long arc of time, there's nothing that really has value. Value is something that is made up by people at a specific time and a specific place. So then value is meaningless? And I guess therefore, by extension, my life is then meaningless? Absolutely not. Everyone's life is meaningful and everyone's life is valuable precisely because we give our lives meaning and value. Just because we come up with value doesn't make it less important than if value were to come from the atoms that make up something's existence. The bigger point here is that because it is something we make up, value should reflect the interpretation of all people to the extent possible. The problem specifically with the subjective theory of value is that it's narrowing value to only the buyer and seller's perspective. Okay, good. I was starting to have an existential crisis there. So we aren't born with this encyclopedic knowledge of commodity values. We learn them from other people's perspectives as we grow up. I think then we should examine how these outside perspectives, apart from the buyer and seller, come up with value. Okay, well, I think it's important to note that from this outside perspective, which we'll call society, there's a widespread recognition of the usefulness of commodities. Yeah, like Champion clothing. It's useful because it covers up our nakedness and provides us with warmth. And it's also a brand that tells everyone around me that I'm athletic. Right. Like that one piece shirt you're wearing says I'm a dork and I know it. And also I like to show off my skinny chicken arms that I've built up while climbing. Well, yeah, I guess, but wait a second. You know what we're forgetting here? The society immediately surrounding us, let's call it our community, may recognize and associate clothing brands with certain useful characteristics and thus value them for that. But other cultures and other communities may not, especially when our clothing trash ends up washing up on their shores. Wait, how does branded clothing lead to trash on other country shores? Clothing tentacles are a topic for another day. Okay, but your point is that even something like usefulness can vary not only from one person to another, but also from one community to another. Yeah. Okay, then, so I guess the goal is to try to find the closest approximation of the collective valuation of a commodity from the perspective of 8 billion people? Well, when you put it that way, it sounds really tough. True. Maybe we can make it easier by breaking up a commodity into its components. Okay, I like that. But hold on to that thought for a second, because I think we need to go back and define what we mean when we say useful. Like, if I go outside and make sounds stomping on the ground, why would no one consider that useful, whereas Apple AirPods are considered useful? Is music even useful? I mean, can we consider Apple AirPods useful? Yeah, I think so. I mean, usefulness is a human construct. The AirPods are useful to us because they're fulfilling some want or need of ours. Now, maybe it's not on the same level as something like food, but it still fulfills a desire. In this case, the enjoyment of the creative. Use value. So Marx actually is quoting Adam Smith here: the fitness to supply the necessities or serve the conveniences of human life. The use value of something is its usefulness. This is based on the qualitative aspects of a thing or commodity, but that still is subject to the time, person, and place. Okay, so music and art can have usefulness because they satisfy a human need or desire. Yeah. So we return to the prior question. What makes Apple AirPods more useful to us than me stomping on the ground? What's different about them? Well, it's not just the quality of those sounds that are different, but also the resources and labor that went into making them that are different. That's a great point. And that brings us back to the components we were talking about before. It's kind of like Aristotle's four causes. What do you mean? All right. Well, what explains or causes the existence of AirPods? Well, I guess someone decided they wanted to listen to music without having to deal with tangling cords. Oh, and they really wanted it from that company that has that crisp Apple logo. That's true. You could answer that question that way. But there are three other explanations or causes, according to Aristotle, which explain why those AirPods exist. The human function, its usefulness, is the final cause. In that sense, something comes to be because of its end purpose, what we decided to make it for. In today's society, that's mostly what we think about when we think about why something exists. Why does a table exist? For decoration or to hold something? Why does a ball exist? To play with. That kind of explains why it's taken us so long to get to this point. Most of us look around us and see objects and think, oh, doesn't that look nice? Or how could I use this? Or how could that fulfill some want or need of mine? So what are we missing then? Well, what else explains something being what it is? Well, I guess someone or something made it? Yeah. Someone, the efficient cause, or something, the material cause, made it. In other words, the efficient cause is the human labor and technology that goes into making something, while the material cause are the resources that are used to make it. Okay, so let's pause here. So we have the final cause, which is something's use value. We have the efficient cause, which is the technology and people that bring the commodity into existence. And we have the material cause, which is what makes it up. All these things help to explain why something exists, and you said there was one more, right? Yep. So let's imagine we put all the labor and materials necessary to make AirPods, and we also knew what the AirPods in purpose would be. If we put all that in one room, would we then have a set of AirPods?
Well, no, because you'd still have to make them.
Exactly, and that's the last one, the formal cause, which could just be thought of as the form the object takes, or its design, its structure. Without the object taking form, then we don't have anything.
Okay, so I understand how something like an AirPod could have four causes, but what about me stomping my feet on the ground and making sounds? What is that's four causes?
Well, we have the final cause, the purpose of the thing, which in this case is to make sound. Then there are the material and efficient causes. Your feet, the air, the ground all contribute to making up the stomping's sound waves, and then you yourself act as the efficient cause creating the sounds. The formal cause would be the form that this thing takes, in this case, sound waves.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. So what you're saying is that it's not just how useful something is that makes it exist and thus gives it value, but also who makes it, what makes it, and what form it takes.
Exactly, and that is what we were missing before with the subjective theory of value. We were only considering the use value of something, and we were missing the material and human causes as well as the formation of the thing. If we compare the sound-making abilities of your feet versus an AirPod, then it makes sense that we would see AirPods being valued more because there are more labor and resources put into making them. Also, there's the fact that stomping on the ground probably just doesn't satisfy many people's desire for musical enjoyment.
Okay, so then value, it's almost like it comes from these four causes, these four explanations of something's existence.
Right. So if we take a commodity and we want to value it, then we should consider its usefulness, labor, resources, and formation.
Yes, that's what we should consider when measuring value.
So then, back to Black Friday?
Yeah, I like what you said earlier when you were talking about Black Friday.
What's that?
It was like this yearly festival celebrating the buyer and the seller.
Yeah, Black Friday, the festival of the commodity.
Black Friday is kind of like a microcosm of our valuation of commodities, one that emphasizes the perspective of the buyer and the seller, but fails to recognize others, like the worker on Black Friday who participates in the same rush and crowds and savings, but from their perspective sees the shallowness and frustration and individualization of the event. Also, look at the effect of resource extraction on the environment and the toll on workers in factories. Their perspectives are put at best second to those of the buyer and the seller. Now, none of this is to vilify the buyer for participating because they're often unaware of the extent to which the satisfaction of their own needs and desires comes at a cost to people and communities and environments the world over. Granted, there's probably more awareness of these negative aspects of production in today's society, which doesn't excuse total ignorance. But even then, sellers are banking on this awareness by greenwashing their products and promoting fair trade agreements, which may reflect the valuation of other perspectives to a small extent, but in most cases, like with recycling, is just a misleading tactic used to increase brand loyalty. In the end, I think it's fair to say that we value the commodity itself more than the resources and relationships that come to make it up.
That's deep.
I mean, kinda, but I think it's also something most people see in today's society.
So then if we all know Black Friday is problematic, what do?
We realign what we value and we restructure society in a way that aligns with what we value.
How so?
Well, take for instance the archetypal concept of welfare queen versus unethical CEO. Don't judge how often these types of people occur, but just consider your feelings and attitudes about these two types of people. Okay. To me, there's this idea that if we're to somehow rank them, the welfare queen is worse off for society than the unethical CEO. They're not as productive, some people would argue, even if the CEO is cutting costs by paying lower wages. But they're both using the established system in their favor, with the primary goal being make money rather than promote the health and well-being of yourself and those around you. Now, I'm not saying that we should rank a unethical CEO as worse than a hypothetical welfare queen. In fact, that's kind of the point. I'm not saying that we should create a hierarchy of productive people in our society at all. Generally, I would say from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. That is idealistic. I know. I mean, how do you even define need and ability? Practically, you're right, but for now, I just try to apply that ideal to my own life. What do I really need, and what am I able to give to others? Okay, I see what you're saying, but it still sounds more like a way for you to live your life than a practical step society could take moving forward. That's a fair point. What if we could switch Black Friday and Giving Tuesday? What if instead of celebrating the commodity the day after Thanksgiving, when we give thanks to family and friends, what if we instead celebrated the ways we were able to give? Not just the act of actually giving, but also talking with family and friends about giving. Talking about the issues that are important to us. What if, even with just $1, we supported our friends' charities that they felt passionate about? What if we spent the day together watching documentaries about social issues that we find important? If we had more discussions talking about how we should construct our society to care for the most vulnerable? What if we made that Friday a national day of volunteering, a federal holiday where everyone was encouraged to go out and do something for others or for the environment, just for the sake of it? What if we gathered for walks for justice that rivaled the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade? If that sounds political, it is. The personal is political. The ways we structure our society, the laws, the governing bodies, and our exchange systems, they all have an impact on people and the environment. So what are you proposing? That we talk about what we value and encourage others to do the same. There are pockets of people the world over passionate about equality whose ideas will begin to realign our societal values. And for me, I can always remember that Black Friday is really